the reason then the Noah ark story is a very small part of the book of Genesis. And the story of Uthman in the epic of Gilgamesh is a little bit more stretched out. It has more to do with the theme of what they're doing. So they're obviously parallel because these are both ancient relational stories, and they're products of their work. In the same way that I think we see parallels between some of the New Testament Gospels and other ancient Greco-Roman biography, in that these are products of ancient history, and so they're going to look like other ancient historical writings that kind of parallel around them. Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't make sense. It's just when you're talking about the oldest of old stories, it's always so interesting to wonder, like when they're taking these oral traditions, like Socrates is famous for saying that he didn't believe you should write things.
Yeah,
right.
Make people lazy.
Right. We need to learn how to remember things. You need to exercise your memory, which is so fascinating when you think that there must have been people that were in charge of memorizing these oral traditions.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about, particularly if you're talking about the Old Testament, the series of writings, like these are long stories that someone had to remember and pass on to generations. So the thing with me was always like, well, what was the origin of all this? Like, what was the first version of it, and where the hell did it come from? And what was it? What was going on? Where these people felt like in this time of incredibly difficult survival, right? You're essentially, hunter-gatherers, right? We're talking about thousands of years ago. And these people took great time and made great effort to preserve these stories. And then there's always human error, right? There's human error, as you were saying, with transcription and trying to decipher things and write things down. We don't really speak the language. You gotta wonder, like, how much did we lose in this oral tradition? Like, what was the original story? And what were they trying to convey?
Yeah, and I think that there's an aspect of like a message just trying to be communicated. I mean, we are modern people of the Enlightenment. So we almost have a perspective where we want something to be very like exhaustive, that ancient writers didn't have those same sort of conventions. Or so they're going to capitalize on certain ideas and concepts for the purpose of, when someone tells you a story, you don't memorize everything. You go to university, you write units, right? The people who are writing everything the professor is saying word for word, probably not the people who are going to remember what the professor says as well as the people who write down the main things. And when you write down the main things, the main points, without all of the other stuff that kind of is just, it's icing, then you get the main idea more. Ancient writers talk about this. So there's a guy named Quintilian who exists in the 1st century BC, and there's this series of writings that we call progymnasmata, which are basically like, how do you do good writing? So he's training people, maybe even individuals like Plutarch, who is one of the best-known ancient biographers, and saying, like, it's just as important what you don't say as to what you do say. Because you don't want to, A, writing in the ancient world is expensive, really expensive, and B, you want to make sure that your audience is actually getting the message that you want to convey. And so, this is something that when you read, like, German scholars, biblical scholars of the 19th and 20th century, or even part of that, like 18th, 19th century, they look at the Gospels and they're like, this is a biography, because it's not capitalizing on Jesus' childhood. And we all know that good biographies tell about your childhood and psychologize and these sorts of things. Whereas if you look at some of these ancient writers who are talking about how you should write biography, they say, if there's nothing in their childhood that's that significant, don't write it. It's going to distract from, like, if there is something, say like Jesus' birth, or Luke tells a story when he's 12 of Jesus, when he goes with Mary and Joseph, and Mary and Joseph lose the Son of God, start going home without it, and they're like, "Where's Jesus?" And they gotta go back to Jerusalem. That's a significant story, and so it appears that Luke includes it because there's a significant reason to include it. But they wouldn't have had any problem with leaving out large portions of someone's life if it didn't contribute to what the ultimate goal of telling that person's life was.
I think what's important is we have to try, as difficult as it might be, to put our minds in the context of people who lived in a time where most people were illiterate, and you were telling these parables, you're telling these stories as an oral tradition, and that they have a different mindset in terms of the distribution of information and what the significance of these things are.
Yeah. Yeah, these are documents, well, in terms of the Bible, like, as someone who identifies as a Christian, I would say that the Bible was written for you, but it wasn't written to you. It had a completely different original audience.
Mm-hmm.
But you should do your best at figuring out who it was written to and how that made a difference for them, because then the application is going to come out even clearer for you. And that should be ultimately, the goal of everyone who's looking at ancient documents. Who is the original audience? How would they have understood it?
Yeah.
Because you can read all sorts of things because of your modern theologians into what someone is talking about in the ancient world and completely bypass what they're actually trying to convey in intention.
Yeah, and again, it's almost impossible to put your mind completely into the context of these people that were living then. It's almost impossible to imagine the way they viewed the world and the way they communicated. And when you're dealing with like really old stuff like the Sumerian text, and then people have translations of it which can be fantastical, like the Zechariah Sitchin stuff. It's like you have to be a scholar in ancient Sumerian and understand the origins of language, and you have to, and then still there's massive debate. There's a whole website called sitchiniswrong.com.
Yeah.
But he's the most fun.
He's fun. I'm not convinced he could read Sumerian either. Really?
I think he's bullshit.
I'd like to give him the benefit of the doubt. He takes so many liberties with the stuff he's commenting on that I have a hard time getting my head around.
So if he couldn't read it, where would he be getting his translations?
From actual translation.
Okay, so he would take these translations and then make his own assumptions and his own interpretation. Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think to a certain degree. Even something like Nibiru is not a Sumerian word; it's an Akkadian word. But he makes a big deal about it being related to Sumerian, and it is a word that appears within Akkadian.
And Akkadian is what time period?
Akkadian is just after, so it exists kind of in a crossover where Sumerian predates Akkadian, but Akkadian develops alongside, and then as cultures like the Assyrians come into power and kind of subvert the Sumerians.
So oldest Sumerian writing is what? What's the oldest timeline? Like 5,000?
Yeah, around that. I think like 4 to 5,000 years ago.
Okay. And then Akkadian is when?
There's some overlap, but it develops into a language like just after, like the rise. And Akkadian develops into like it has stages, and then you have like Babylonian, Proto-Babylonian, Persian, Old Persian, Elamite.
We don't have it. There's no writing at all to go back to chapter, correct? It's all just iconography.
Yeah, or at least that we figured out that looks like writing. Yeah, I'm really hoping to go back to it.
What's your take on this whole reluctance to further excavate? We have such a small amount of the site. It's only 5% that's been uncovered, but through LiDAR, there's a bunch more.
Yeah, I'm not an archaeologist. I have friends who are archaeologists, and I think archaeology is tricky because so much of archaeology is dependent on governments and institutions and funding. That getting mad at archaeologists for not excavating is kind of like getting mad at construction workers for not fixing potholes. Where it's like, like they're kind of doing the last stage. So Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly incentive by the Turkish government to want to capitalize on that being a tourist destination. And you really need to safeguard archaeological excavations because otherwise it's being compromised
Right.
and like pillaging and stuff like that. It happens. I mean, when I was in Egypt 2 summers ago, and you go to the Valley of the Kings, they've got security cameras up everywhere because there are tombs there that we still haven't discovered. And so they're like, we don't want people digging around in here looking for.
So they've lost so much over history.
Oh, we've only discovered 1% of ancient Egypt.
That's so nuts.
1%. Isn't that crazy?
That is the nuttiest part of all of history is Egypt to me. I still have not been.
You gotta go.
I know.
You
I almost
gotta
went in December. I just couldn't find the time. I'm just too damn busy. I will though. I will. I definitely will. But it is to me the nuttiest time in history because good luck explaining the Great Pyramid. Good luck.
And it's such a big time frame. Like there's 1,000 years between the pyramids being built and Tutankhamun and the Valley of the Kings.
Yeah.
1,000 years.
Yeah. Nuts.
It's so crazy. Egypt is one of the wildest places you'll ever go.
Well, it just doesn't make sense. It's like, how? What were you guys using? What were you doing? How'd you do it? How'd you measure it? How'd you figure it out?
Yeah. You've been to Greece, right?
Yeah.
So you've been to Jordan?
No.
Oh, you gotta go see Petra.
Yeah.
Petra's phenomenal.
Jordan was, Greece rather was fantastic.
They're all crazy.
God, it's just like when you're just there in the presence of these things and just trying to put your brain back thousands of years and imagine what society was like back then.
It's crazy. It's crazy. Egypt was crazy because Egypt is like Greece in that you have like, you can go to the Pantheon and you see that kind of stuff, right? But you go to Egypt and there's 4,000-year-old paint on it. You're like, what? I can't get paint to stay on my wall for 10 years. And it's almost exclusively because of the climate. And it got buried in sand. But it's so wild. So
when you say that 1% of ancient Egypt has been discovered, what do you really mean by that?
of the percentage of what we know that happened in Egyptian history, 1% has been excavated in terms of what we can actually pull out of the ground and look at artifacts. So there's whole eras of pharaohs that we don't know where they're buried. Like even when Tutankhamun was discovered, he was kind of a footnote in the pharaohs that we knew about at that time. And we didn't know he was, as extravagant, as rich, as, until we discovered his actual tomb. A lot of people at that time didn't even think he was worth looking into, because we have these lists of pharaohs, and the thing with the pharaohs is that the next pharaoh is always trying to prove that he's a better one. And this is why you go to Egypt and you find statues of Ramses everywhere. And part of it was because Ramses, I think it was Ramses II, he commissioned so many statues of himself. Because he's like, oh, I'm the best and the greatest. And what they actually couldn't keep up with the commissioning, they started actually rubbing off the names of previous pharaohs on statues and just putting Ramses on it.
Really?
Because
Wow.
he was just, so you go like, from the top of Egypt to the bottom of Egypt, and you're going to find statues of Ramses.
He wanted to leave his mark.
He wanted to leave, and he did, right? Like it worked.
We're talking about it now,
I know.
2024.
I know.
Yeah, that is nuts. So when you go there and you're in the presence of these things and you try to put yourself back into that time period, like, have you ever tried to think, like, what was the motivation to make something as great as the Pyramid of Giza, the Great Pyramid?
People definitely want to make their mark, right?
I mean, that's a mark that just doesn't even make sense.
There's something to that. I mean, if you think you're a god,
Right.
and you have this whole kind of worldly perspective and theology that you need to make something that and bury yourself with all this crap because that's going to make a difference in your afterlife, then you're a little big rather than home, right? So the perceptions of people in the ancient world are just so different. We got it so good, right? Like longevity, health, food, it's just on a completely different scale. And so the conventions of needing to make sure that especially if you're like the richest guy around, if you tick off all the boxes, because you know you're going to die, and you're probably going to die sooner than you want to, sooner rather than later, and you have this whole perception of, well, you know, if I bury myself with all this stuff and maybe even some of the people, which can kill them and include them too, because they're going to help me out faster than help me out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Khufu's pyramid, what's the timeline that he was using out?
I don't know. I'm not an Egyptologist or an archaeologist necessarily, but he was. I think that was what, 4,000 years ago. We only really got a tiny statue of him.
I guess he was busy making a pyramid.
So they say, right?
So they say.
Everybody thinks different, but
A lot of people think that. You know, that's what's interesting about it is the archaeological argument that like Dr. Robert Schoch makes about the water erosion in the Temple of the Sphinx.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating argument because it does appear like that's water erosion, and that would put the timeline way back.
yeah, I think even just looking at the Sphinx, you can tell that no matter what your perspective is, you should entertain the idea, at minimum, that the head was built later.
Yeah, for sure.
Because it doesn't fit the body.
It has much less erosion. But you could also attribute that to the different densities of the stone. Like, that's one of the things about these layers of limestone. So some of them are much more porous and some they erode easier.
Yeah.
You do see that,
Yeah.
you know, and I think they're doing a terrible disservice by covering the Sphinx with, like, new stones. And, you know, they redid the paws and they're doing all that. Like, my God, people, like, leave it alone. Like, leave it the way it is.
Yeah, it's this tricky balance between
Restoration and recreation.
yeah,
Because they're in a recreation stage.
yeah,
And it was obviously, they're doing it with smaller stones, and it like looks different. It's not the same thing. It's not what it initially was. It was carved from one piece of stone.
Have you seen some of the restoration stuff that Hussein did in Iraq?
No.
Jamie, you gotta pull up the ziggurat at Ur.
Oh no.
So, Saddam Hussein was a bit of a nut job. Like, he believed, as this is as far as I understand it, that he was the recreation of Nebuchadnezzar. So he did all of this restorative work in Iraq on things like the walls of Babylon, and in Ur, he rebuilt the ziggurat. So if you look at that picture over there, which is 1932 and 2022, that's what he did. Is he basically tried to rebuild this entire thing, and it's amazing. I'm trying hard to get there because I wanna see this thing. Interestingly enough, yeah, don't go over there. So that's actually Ur.
So I'm sorry, but so this is the modern version with the small bricks. The original version, was it all carved from one piece?
No, it would have been clay bricks.
So these were clay bricks. So what do we? Jamie, can you go back to the 1930 image, please, so we can see what it looked like? God, I would rather just have that. You know, I mean, I want to see what it looked like and what it looks like all these years later. I can't really see the recreation, which is very similar to what they've done with the Sphinx.
Yeah, the Sphinx. Even when I was in Egypt, they were doing some work in like.
Jamie, can you go to the rehabilitation of the Sphinx or whatever they call it?
Yeah, they put like a room with it.
Yeah. Well, the restoration part is the interesting part. Like, you can see the restoration. You go to just Google restoration of the Sphinx paws.
Well, they're talking about putting encasing stone in the pyramid.
Yeah, I've heard that too. God, don't do that.
I don't think they should do that.
No, you shouldn't do anything. I mean, obviously, they took the original casing stones off, but that's also history. So
Yeah.
now you can see, like, the new paws. But that seems like the difference between buried and unburied.
Yeah.
So, like, even when Napoleon came, like, right there, like, it was not restored.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because there was much more erosion. Napoleon came upon it was buried, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
I
So,
think that was
like, over time, because you're dealing with these crazy sandstorms, over time, everything gets kind of buried.
Oh, so much of it is under sand for so long. Like the temple of the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut was mostly under sand for a long, long time.
Wow.
Before they like uncovered it. Unfortunately, like the aridness of Egypt preserves things like crazy.
Yeah, see, that's the full closet. That's a disaster. That's so gross. When, you know, if you do take that timeline, the Robert Schoch timeline, and you say, okay, so you're talking about thousands of years of rainfall, you have to go back to when there was rainfall in the Nile Valley, so now you're back like 9,000 years. Like, one of the more interesting things about hieroglyphs and the interpretations of it is that the ancient hieroglyphs, the ancient versions of pharaohs, rather, like when they go back, you know, past the established dates of 2500 BC and before that, you get to like 30,000 years ago, and then they say that these are myth. These are not, this is not representative of an actual history. This is some sort of a mythical history.
Yeah, numbers are tricky in ancient languages because it's not entirely clear whether numbers are meant to be representational.
Is that like why they said that Noah lived 600 years old?
Yeah, that's part of it. I mean, you have the Sumerian king lists, which have people living thousands of years, hundreds and thousands of years too. And I mean, there's some interesting academic articles on like the probability of the numbers that come up in those, because we have a base 10 counting system because we count our fingers. Ancient Near Eastern cultures like the Babylonians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, they had a base 12 counting system because they would count each hinge already, like space 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
There's different joints of the thing.
Yeah, the joints. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
And so that's why we have 360 degrees in a circle, 365 days in a year. Like this comes from the Mesopotamian counting conventions. And you look at some of these lists, and they're operational and all divisible by like 12 and 60. You're like, what's going on here? So not all of them, but enough of them where it's statistically impossible. And I don't totally know what to make of those things, because you do have the genealogies, I believe it's Genesis chapter 4, Genesis chapter 11, where they're all divisible by these types of numbers that were very common in ancient Near East. They're not random. Whereas if you look at the genealogies later in like Chronicles and Kings of the ages of the Israelite kings, they're random. And so it's just like, what do we do with that?
Right.
Because numbers are also far more representational, which is why we see numbers like 12 and 40 and 7 come up in the Bible, but also other ancient Near Eastern literature. Like there are certain numbers in Egyptian society that also were seen as like perfect numbers, or like numbers that you wanted to incorporate. So,
what's the earliest interpretation of calendars? Like, what is the earliest where
Just
they
giving you a
did
time
decide
reference.
what a year was?
I have no idea.
Because you got to imagine, if you know, the average lifespan wasn't so good back then.
Yeah.
A lot of people got infected, died of war, famine, all these things. It would take quite a long time for people to figure out what a year was.
Right.
I mean, we're going thousands and thousands of years ago. We have to establish, like, okay, a day is, let's put the stick in the ground. When the shadow's here, this is where we start.
Yeah.
When the shadow goes all the way around like that, okay, maybe we can like mark these off, okay, now we've got a sundial.
And there are different timekeeping conventions depending on society. Like ancient Jews had a different timekeeping convention than ancient Romans. And so that's why you see, like in Genesis chapter 1, it talks about there being evening and there being morning. Is because, well, Jews today, right? You start the Sabbath on sundown the day before, right? So that's why. It's because there's different cycles, and so we go on a 24-hour time system. But ancient Jews had a different convention of that. Ancient Romans had a different convention of that. Ancient, Mesopotamian cultures had their own kind of conventions about these things, and calendars were all over the place. In when you get to the Julian calendar, and they're like, we gotta standardize this thing because everybody's operating on a different, the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar. Ancient timekeeping is very inexact and very messy, and so you kind of got to take certain things with a grain of salt,
Right.
in terms of that. But ancient calendars, I don't even know. I know that talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the group in Qumran, who were like they were a sectarian group of Jews who believed that the Jews in Jerusalem had basically capitulated, and we're not holy enough. And part of their reasoning is that they believe they have a, and so they use a different calendar that doesn't have to do things like incorporate an extra month every certain number of years, because their thing is not perfect.
Yeah.
And part of their reasoning is
You gonna go to 27
like,
fat grip?
the chosen
Yeah.
is that they have a timekeeping system that they say is perfect.
Make it loose the book.
Many cultures used a 13-month calendar, right? Like, what was the logic behind that? Does that work?
I don't know.
Yes.
So the idea was 13 months, 28 days each month,
Yes.
and you wouldn't have to have leap years and all that shit.
Yeah.
Archaeologists, okay, here it is, world oldest calendar, 12,000 years old.
Yeah, that's wild.
Oh, so it is on Göbekli Tepe. Oh, the ancient carvings of the sun, moon, and various constellations sits in a pillar. Göbekli Tepe, 12,000 years old. Researchers believe ancient people use a so-called lunisolar calendar to mark the changing of the seasons.
Right.
Interesting. So it was at least representative of the fact that we know when the days start getting shorter, it starts getting colder, and then and then it warms up again. Days start getting longer.
This is why solstices are so key in like most of human history.
Right.
It's because you got to figure out like what's a marker point.
Right. Which is one of the things that's so fascinating about some of the constructions of the pyramid, where on the summer solstice, these pillars line up so perfectly that the light shines straight down these hallways and illuminates everything. So
Right. An analogy of that which is unpredictable. And actually, there's a lot of concepts of the realm of the dead being in the sea that we see throughout this literature. If you read the book of Jonah, there's this kind of stylistic, which you miss when you read it in the English, but it's very apparent in the Hebrew, where Noah keeps going down. He goes down from his town to the dock, and then he goes down into the boat, and then he goes down into the inside of the boat, and then a storm happens, and then they throw him overboard down into the sea and down into the fish, and the fish takes him down into the depths. And when Jonah prays, he says, "I cry out from the depths of Sheol," which is the realm of the dead. So there is actually a form of Jewish interpretation where it argues that Jonah actually died and was resurrected when he was spit up by the fish. And it could be because in the Gospels, Jesus says, all the people are following him and they keep asking him for miracles. Because they're like, "We saw you do miracles, do more miracles for us. Come on, do a trick, do a trick."
Right.
And Jesus says, the only miracle you're going to get is the sign of Jonah. That just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights, I will be in the belly of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. Prediction of his own death and resurrection. But there is an argument within rabbinical literature that when Jonah says that he's crying out from the depths of Sheol, it's because he's actually dead. And that's one interpretation. But another interpretation could just be that he saw and understood, as a person of his day, the depths of the ocean as where the dead people ended up anyways. Like your soul goes down into the chaos and the disorder of Sheol, which is the realm of the dead.
Is that where they dispose of bodies?
In the ocean?
Yeah.
No.
No? Vikings did, right? Didn't they light boats on fire and push them out there?
Yeah.
Yeah. But it wasn't a common practice amongst other civilizations.
Not that I know of. I mean, Jews would definitely, really ancient Jewish conventions of burial, you would just bury someone in the earth, and then by the time you get to Jesus' day, you had family tombs and stuff.
Well, there was an ancient hominid that's not human, and one of the things that they were so fascinated about was that they buried their dead. And that they did so in a cave. Do you remember that, Jamie? Do you remember who was discussing that with us?
Can you feel yourself getting
It was, they did not think that this version of ancient primate was capable of these things. And then they seemed to have confirmation through these very extensive cave systems that there was at least one area where they would put their dead.
Yeah.
And it was a difficult path to get to this too. This is a very small hominid, and I think people have tried to make their way through it, and it's really hard. Some of these caves, you're basically crawling on your stomach, which is fucking terrifying, because people have died that way.
Are you claustrophobic?
No, I'm not claustrophobic. That's normal
You
stuff.
just don't want to crawl in a
I don't want to
cave?
crawl out in the middle of the earth into something that's like 11 inches high.
Yeah.
And squirming slowly. That's what they're doing.
Yeah.
It barely fits in there. Died recently. Oh, it was Brian, yes. That's right. Yeah, so they found that this ancient hominid, which, didn't really look like us,
Yeah.
was burying their dead.
Yeah. I mean, burial conventions change over time.
Mm.
The ways that they're burying, like, in the ancient Israelite days are very different in the conventions than when you get to Jesus.
Curious archaeologists uncovered evidence of intentional burial cave engravings by early human ancestor. What did that sucker look like? So the Denaldi chamber, what is the type of Homo naledi, right? Homo naledi. Google that, see what they look like. Homo naledi. What we think they look like, right? Whoa, that's crazy. That's crazy. So as a Christian,
Mhm.
what do you think about all this stuff? Like, what do you think about ancient hominids, Pithecanthropus, Neanderthals? Like, what was God up to with all this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a scientist, so I gotta stay in my lane. I ultimately would be an advocate for intelligent design, where I would say that that God purposefully created humanity in a way. You had Stephen Meyer on, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, he's one of those guys who talks about kind of the issues that he sees with evolution. And I think I have some of those issues too. My friend Jonathan McClatchy is a biologist, and he does some really great presentations on the ways that he sees kind of the intricacies of Neo-Darwinian evolution is not quite explaining some of what's going on with things like the fossil record and some of the gaps that we have in there. When you talk about early hominids, I mean, ultimately, I think that there are aspects of the fact that there are ancient cultures which, I mean, humanity obviously looks very different today than it did, if we're going tens of thousands of years ago.
Right.
And so I think that there's a different kind of convention in understanding, but ultimately I would ascribe to there being an original Adam and Eve. Those are like, if you want to call them like our first parents kind of thing. But there are other Christians who I would disagree with, but I think have interesting articulations of that in terms of theistic evolution. I disagree with them, but it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility to find explanations. I don't think the Bible is trying to explain how people came into existence in the same way that maybe we want it to. And a lot of people read the origin stories in Genesis as a scientific textbook. And I think ultimately that misses the point of what Genesis is trying to say. This goes back to what we were talking about with like, how did the original audience understood this?
Right.
When they read Genesis chapter 1, are they looking at that as an exact prescription of what God did? I mean, in some ways maybe, but in other ways, they could see that as this like counter-apologetic to the other ancient Near Eastern stories, like I explained. So I just think we need to be careful when we're looking at, or even like counting up the genealogies and coming up with, how old the earth is. I think that might be just a forest for the trees in what we're actually looking at when we look at ancient documents and how we're trying to interpret them. But it is a big question, right?
Well, the question of evolution is a fascinating one, right? Because there's obviously something happening, particularly with us, if we really are related to Homo naledi, or there's something clearly is happening. There's like process of change. And if we don't completely understand all the factors in that process of change, we might miss out. The equation might be incomplete. It's like we know a lot now about evolution that we did not know before. But like all sciences, new data comes in and you have to recalibrate things. Like, have you been paying attention to this? There's a new discussion about dark matter and dark energy.
No.
The new discussion is that it might not be a correct theory, and that what it might be is that time moves differently in the voids between galaxies. And and this is a new theory,
Mhm.
and like new enough and discussed enough among people that really understand it that it's getting to me. Right, so I'm reading it.
Right.
So
Sorry.
see if you can
I mean,
find
I
it.
guess.
Yeah. But like all sciences, new data comes in and you have to recalibrate things. Like,
Yeah.
have you been paying attention to this? There's a new discussion about dark matter and dark energy.
No.
The new discussion is that it might not be a correct theory, and that what it might be is that time moves differently in the voids between galaxies.
Hmm.
And this is a new theory.
Gravity.
And, like new enough and discussed enough among people that really understand it that it's getting to me. Right, so I'm reading
Yeah,
it.
like,
Right.
So see if you can find that.
right, like what
That's
Yeah,
literally what I'm trying to explain.
it's a
to you
very
about
complex
time doesn't
and
exist.
nuanced
That's why
conversation, but
time doesn't
most of the
exist.
universe is
Right.
dark energy, right? It's a giant percentage of the universe is dark energy and dark matter, and we don't really know what that stuff is. And so this is proposing that there's an additional possible
they
theory
have this
that might
concept that
explain
like
it better.
what's
I mean,
in
that area
my
of
hands
science
is
is
different than this. But like when you
Then you have the
think about
James Webb
the distance
telescope that's
between
giving you
space
even more
and
data
how
than ever
time
before, and it's like,
travels
and you have to look at all of them and go,
Sound
wait, why are those
travels
things here?
different
How are they there so
through
long
metal,
ago? Like, what are these red
everything
things
else.
at the beginning of time? Like, what the
This
fuck
could
is all
The universe
be
is
the
bonkers.
universe.
nuts?
Yeah, and I mean,
This
I think
isn't as dense as
well,
this.
we get that in history too,
This
whereas we
got
have these
different
kind of
things
what we
in it.
think
This
are
got
established
different
conventions, and then all of a sudden we discover
Things
something
travel
that
through
completely
it
overthrows
differently.
the
That's
ideas that we
the
have.
Close
art's not
Yeah, or go back to Tepe.
Yeah.
Or actually, good segue.
That's the best one, right?
So yeah, I made something for you. So I make papyri facsimiles. The description is a little bit wonky here. So you were talking about like the manuscript evidence. So this guy is P52.
Yes.
John Rylands 457. So that's a genuine Egyptian papyri that I made. I cut it out for you, and then I transcribed the text on that manuscript. So when we're talking about what is potentially our oldest evidence for the New Testament, this manuscript that most likely comes from Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, is the one that usually is universally accepted as our oldest one. And that contains John 18, where Jesus is on trial before Pilate. And yeah, so that's the one that's in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England.
So this is a copy of that exactly? This is exactly what it looks like?
Yeah, so I cut that out on the papyri with a scalpel, and then I transcribed the text on.
You did a great job, dude.
And
This is, you nerded out.
I know, I'm
For real nerded out. This
I'm-
is a real nerding out of.
So that's actually, so that's someone else's facsimile, which is not as good as the one I made.
It's not as good. Yours is better.
And where Jesus is on trial before Pilate, and Jesus says, everyone who follows the truth, who is following the truth, follows me. And on the back has the words of Pilate saying, what is truth? But so part of my research, so the reason I bring this up is because before this was discovered by C.H. Roberts in the 1940s, the convention was, because of a guy named C.H. Bauer, that the Gospel of John was 2nd century. And so he was a student of Hegel. Have you ever heard of Hegelian dialectic? So you have like a thesis, synthesis, and antithesis.
Yeah.
So Hegel had this philosophical theory, and his student Bauer takes that and incorporates this into history. And he says, the earliest gospel, Mark, has this very Jewish Jesus, and then the later gospels have a very the last of what are called the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Luke has a very kind of more divine Jesus, and so he says, based on this, John is the last one, and it combines these two, where you get a very human and a very divine Jesus together. And so based on this, he says that John has to be 2nd century. When he started this, C.H. Roberts is literally going through these piles of manuscripts and these drawers that are being stashed away, and he finds this guy, and he sees that it's written on both sides, which is almost exclusively a Christian convention. Because in the ancient world they used scrolls, and the Christians, for reasons we're not entirely clear on, they start to make codices, books. And so they write on both sides. And so he says, okay, this is written on both sides. It's probably a Christian manuscript. So he sends it off to the leading paleographers, or guys who date manuscripts. And they all say this is the beginning of the second century. And so there's still debate about the dating of this, but the unanimous consensus is that it's comfortably second century, potentially the beginning of the second century, which means that this is found in Egypt. John is probably writing his gospel in Ephesus, so it has to be written by John, spread around, find its way to Egypt, be copied, and then end up in this manuscript, which means that at minimum, you've already pushed the Gospel of John back into the first century comfortably, and potentially even, like, most likely into the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of these events. And so, all of the literature up until that point, from the scholarly consensus about the dating of the Gospel of John, gets totally rewritten. And it's because of that guy, and because of my academic work where I was telling you, like, in paratextual features, when we look at these tiny manuscripts, and you figure out, okay, well, what does that look like on the page? I also made you. So this is, I used two different variations of papyri. So you have there, where P52 would have been on the page, and based on it's called codicological conventions, the spacings of the words, and the way that the size of the margin that we can see, where it would have been on the page and how big the page would have actually been. So this is like a reconstruction, and then I filled in the rest of the text in the same sort of stylistic hand of the scribes at that time, what that page would have looked like. So this would have come from, would have been essentially like a pocket copy of the Gospel of John.
That's unbelievable. Wow. That's so fascinating.
So this is the kind of work that I do in terms of trying to figure out, okay, you have these fragments. How big would have this codex actually been? How big would have the document been? And then you compare and you contrast them to, say, like non-Christian literature, like Thucydides or Tacitus or Pliny or Cicero or Cassiodoro, those kind of guys, and look at the differences between how these documents would have been put together and written in their day.
God, so beautiful. It's just so bizarre to imagine these people writing this stuff down so long ago.
You know what's wild is when you actually get the chance, which I have a number of times, to actually handle the original documents.
Oh my God.
And
with the rubber gloves?
No, you know why? Is that we used to do that, but actually the oils in your hands are more abrasive than latex or even cloth. So
The oils are more.
no, sorry, I said that wrong. They're less abrasive.
Okay.
So it used to be that you always had to handle things with, gloves, and nowadays we don't do that anymore.
Ooh, that's
So,
wild.
and
Just touching it with your actual fingers. That's
Yeah.
gotta feel bizarre.
I was at the 2 summers ago. I was at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was looking at a manuscript called P1 or P-Oxy 2, 1.2, and it's a beginning of the 3rd century copy of the first page of Matthew's Gospel. And when I requested access to it, they told me that the last person to request it was when Pope John Paul II came and visited the States, and they pulled it out for him. So on the, in the library when you used to have to punch your name, write your name on the cards.
Yeah.
If there was a card, yeah, that guy.